Welcome to Scrolling to Death. I'm Nicki, and today I am bringing you the incredibly talented filmmaker, Sara Robin. Welcome, Sara.
Thanks so much for having me, Nikki. I'm excited to be
Yes,
here.
of course. So, you are currently in production on a new documentary which explores solutions to exploitative tech, and it's called Your Attention Please. And we're going to hear about that today. But I wanted to note I was reading up on the film, and I was on your website, yourattentionplz.com. And there's a very interesting calculator there called Screen Time versus Lifetime. So I'll give you my result, and then encourage listeners to also find out what they score. So basically, you enter your average screen time, then your age, and how much you sleep on average. And I found out that I will be spending 13.9 years of the rest of my waking life on my phone. So that's a pretty powerful fact to reflect on. And I think sets the stage for the predicament that we are in as a society. So let's start with, can you tell me about, I'd love to know about your aha moment that led you to want to bring awareness to
Mm.
this addictive pull of our attention economy.
Yeah, in truth, I will get to the calculator in a moment because that was maybe
Yeah.
the more recent reminder aha moment. But the original aha moment is all the way back in 2009. And it was the first time I encountered Facebook properly, which already shows I was a bit slow on the uptake. I grew up in Germany and I went to a Waldorf school. I like to mention this because now that people get more aware about Waldorf schools, you hear Silicon Valley execs like to send their kids there. It's
Mm.
become more of a topic. So I went to a school that is very low tech, very purposefully so. And when I say low tech, I mean we would have gardening classes, we'd have wood workshop, we would like in third grade we had a farming internship. Like we were taught a lot of hands-on skills. The curriculum was built around doing things with our hands and also doing academic work. And
Mm-hmm.
tech was kept super duper minimal. So much so that we were not allowed to have a school band because they didn't believe in electronically amplified music at my school. Not every Waldorf school is like that. I just want to say that.
Wow.
But that's the extent of
Interesting.
low tech we're talking, right? And this is what Silicon Valley execs like to send their kids. So I think that's just an interesting thing to note. And
Mm-hmm.
so I grew up in a group of friends who, love to be outdoors and love to do arts and all of that. And we weren't really into spending huge amount of times on MySpace. I think that was around at the time,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
That wasn't really our vibe. And I didn't really encounter Facebook properly until I moved countries. And I moved to Australia in 2009 to study my undergrad there. And literally from one day to the next, I traded my friends group from one that was not on Facebook to one where everybody was on Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
And so I could see the difference. And,
Yeah.
when you see the difference, so suddenly that's when you notice things, right? When it's not gradual.
Mm-hmm.
And I just remember thinking, wow, these people really pay a lot of attention to, who said what online and who looked like this in their picture and who liked, whose picture. And that was like what the conversations were about. And I just thought that's really boring. Like, I want to do stuff. I don't want to talk about who said what and who posted what. And I also don't want to take pictures of myself all the time. I think now it's become so normal that we forget. But in the beginning, it was a whole thing, right? You had to stop what you're doing, take a picture with a camera, I think, even in the old days. Then you have to go home and you upload the thing. And it's this whole process and you're constantly interrupting what you're doing. And I was like, this is so weird. Why are we
Yeah.
doing this?
Yeah.
So from the get-go, I thought, okay, I don't like where this is headed. And this was the good old days of Facebook, and everyone was excited. And I was studying international politics at the time, and it was like lauded as this tool that's going to connect us all. And I was just very hesitant, and I didn't go on
Mm-hmm.
Facebook. And that
Yeah.
really started my interest in the whole topic. And for many years, I was an observer, I would say, seeing what's going on, looking for ways to talk about this. Eventually dipped my toes into Facebook, left it again after a year, after I was pretty openly talking about kind of the dark side of what I saw in my own behavior.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't like who I was on Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
I, would be stalking people, trying to find out who was together with whom, and
Yeah.
um, looking at other people's posts and feeling terrible about my own life. And so I could feel that downward spiral happening. And I decided, okay, I'm getting off of this again.
Mm-hmm.
But then, truthfully, what led to what was the moment that led to this film was back in 2019, and I realized I'd become hopelessly addicted to my phone. I was very
Mm-hmm.
frustrated at that. because I was so aware and I thought I was safe, right? Like I wasn't really on social media much. I was on Instagram a bit because I'm a filmmaker and people told me I had to, but
Right.
really didn't get sucked into bad. But my texts and my emails, especially work-related ones, tethered me to my phone. And before I knew it, I was in a place where sleep was shot, memory was shot, my mood was bad, and I blamed a lot of that on my work. I had a sense that maybe the phone didn't help, and then really, when I realized I had to do something, was when I tried to sit down and read a novel for the first time in a couple of years, and I just couldn't get into it.
Like a real book.
A real
Like,
book, yeah, a
yeah.
real book, and sitting and
Right.
reading, getting lost between the pages of a book, and my mind just couldn't do it. It was too slow.
Oh man.
And I mean, I don't know if you can see it here in the back, but I am a bookworm. Like I love
Yeah.
reading.
Yeah. Yeah.
And for me, not being able to read was horrifying. And I really felt like my brain was not what it used to be. Kind of, I guess, that scare that you might get when you get old and you start to forget things, right? And you're like, oh my gosh, it's a scary feeling. I
Yeah.
had that scary feeling. And the scary feeling was like, I can't think complex thoughts anymore. I can't even sit down long enough to have like a straight thought in my head. And at that point I was like, okay, I need to do something. And that's when I started diving into solutions, and ultimately that led to me also wanting to do the film.
Amazing. I interviewed a neuroscientist a few days ago, Dr. Carl Marcy, and he has a book called Rewired about rewiring your brain in the digital age. And he, in our interview, talked about the importance of reading a paper book. So we were talking about parenting and children, and that we can't have them on tablets doing learning apps all the time. Like there's something about the haptics of reading and turning the pages and reading an actual book that's very important for their brain development. But a couple things there that came up for me. You mentioned that a lot of the tech executives send their kids to Waldorf style schools where it's low tech, yet they are producing the tech that our children are getting addicted to. So where is that what you're finding too? I'm hearing this all the time. So why do you think that is? Why do you think that these tech executives are not exposing their own children to social media platforms and high tech lifestyles?
I mean, I think to get to a place where you're creating this tech, that's obviously a very complex thing to do, and you need to value your own thought processes a lot to even get to that place. So I think these are people who very much understand what it takes to succeed in this world and what it takes to pull something off that is very complicated. And they also intimately know their products. So seeing that they give their products a vote of no confidence, I think is something that we should take very seriously.
Right. That in itself, just that fact in itself just makes me decide, my decision to not, my kids are young, 8 and under, but when they get to the point of wanting social media, like just knowing that these tech executives don't find it safe enough to put their children on it, I'm not putting my children on it. And this fact in itself is just important for parents to know. I also love
agree. And when Facebook came out, our school, this was back in, I think, 2007. Mind you, Germany was a bit hesitant anyway, because there's this American company that all of a sudden, makes us all share our data freely online. Like that raised alarm bells, I think, in German society, maybe more so than here.
Yeah.
But our school right away got a parent gathering together and cautioned everyone against going on Facebook. That happened immediately. And I think that is really something I wish I could take everyone on a tour through a Waldorf school. I really do. Because I think it would be really eye-opening to like walk into a room and literally feel like you're, in a classroom 30 years ago. Like we don't even have whiteboards. We have proper blackboards. Like that's what we're talking, right?
Now I'm going to go Google Waldorf schools near me.
Yeah, no, do. It is really so insightful to just let that sink in. Like those are the choices people who are creating these products are making.
Right. In my kids' elementary school, I tell this story often, but they give every kid an iPad in class, and starting in kindergarten, and they have apps on there. They kind of use it as a reward system. Like if you finish your work early or you do a good job, you get more time on your iPad. And I have spoken with, I'm one of them, my very, very minimal amount of parents that have asked to talk to the teachers about what they access and take a look at it. And there's Safari Internet with adult YouTube access and websites that websites that teenagers shouldn't really have access to. It's here in America, I think generally we're just so tech heavy without questioning the harms. And there's a lot
There's
of
this perception out there that when you're online, it's not physical. So how bad can it be? At least my kid's not out on the street. Maybe God forbid, getting hit by a car. Like, thank God my kid is inside. There's a lot of that.
Yeah. Okay. So this is what I focus on this podcast are the harms of screen time and social media. So I highlight and expose when children have been harmed, when children have died by suicide, overdosed on a pill they bought on Snapchat, or just simply are spending too much time on their screens and it's affecting their sleep and their anxiety and their performance in school and their language development and everything else. So anyway, okay. So moving on from that, you're working on this documentary. You've interviewed some powerful and important people in the space, and a couple of which I've interviewed too, like Laura Marquez Garrett, who I'm meeting in person next week. I'm going to go to a hearing for the Neville versus Snap lawsuit in LA. There's a hearing here, so I'm excited to meet her. I've also interviewed Kristen Bride, who's I know highlighted at least in the trailer that I watched. So whose story, I'm sure they all do, but whose story really stayed with you and someone that you've interviewed for the documentary, something that really reinforced your work on this project?
Mm-hmm. That's such a great question. And the short answer is literally everyone we've spoken to. And, some of the interviews we do are the good news interviews, are the hopeful ones. One of the first interviews I got to do was with Cal Newport, who wrote Deep Work and Digital Minimalism. He was one of the first people to come on board and help make the documentary possible in a way. And that interview is amazing. Like he's run an experiment, so to say, with thousands of his readers who voluntarily signed up and underwent a 30-day process, which he calls the digital declutter. And it's about cutting out all optional technology for 30 days and really bringing back your hobbies and your social interactions, things that have been crowded out by tech use, and then seeing how you're doing 30 days later and reassessing which tech you actually want to bring back in. And it's amazing what happens during those 30 days. And it's also incredibly promising to see how quickly that addiction, that I think is fair to call an addiction, how quickly that subsides once you take a step away. So that's a major good news story, And then we have interviews like Laura Marquez Garrett, where just the intensity of the harms, the type of content that is out there that gets fed to kids by algorithms. They don't even seek it out. It gets sent to them. How refined that process is. There's an example she gives where suicide content that was sent to a young man featured train tracks, and he lives near the train. Now you can say coincidence, right? Maybe. But also we know there's location tracking on your apps. We know that they can piece these things together. So maybe it's not, right? Maybe that algorithm figured out that he lives near the train tracks, made the connection. We don't know. And you hear those types of things and you're kind of scared to touch your phone even again, how sinister it can get, I think, is something that most of us are not aware, and the younger generation is more aware because they're exposed to that. And I think that was a big realization for me, that depending on your age and how you engage with technology, what you see on there is very different. So my Instagram looks nothing like an Instagram of a 13-year-old girl.
Right.
A parent Snapchat looks nothing like 13-year-old Snapchat. And I think that also really shows the challenge, right, of as a parent trying to understand what your kid is going through. That requires a lot of active steps. And I think that really sunk in with me, where it's like, it's not just a matter of, get a Snapchat account yourself, familiarize yourself with how this works. No, like that actually doesn't do enough. And I get into a very complex territory of how to manage that.
Yeah, Laura even suggested if you want to let your kids sign up for Snapchat, for example, have them sign up as an adult, because they're actually going to get less harmful content as an adult, which is just so backward And
Isn't it?
yeah,
Yeah. And those are the moments when you go, how is this legal? And I think the answer is it's not. People just don't know.
people just don't know.
Yeah.
And this information is hard to find. Like even I've now been able to connect with on LinkedIn and sort of curate my news feed so I'm getting some of this news, but it's still difficult to find information on the harms. Well, why would you say that is? Why do you say that? Why would you say that the harms around social media are not more available in the main news feeds?
Well, now we get into the real scale, I think, of the David and Goliath challenge that we have here. But we're talking about an industry that controls the flow of information. Not perfectly, like, I don't want people to get hung up on the word control here, but certainly can influence the flow of information very powerfully.
Mm-hmm.
And there are levels to that, right? Like a lot of people now get their news through social media. I think
Mm-hmm.
that is one layer. The other layer is that big tech has an insane amount of money. So the amount of political influence that they can wield through
Yep.
lobbyists, but also through litigation, as we're seeing in California right now with the age appropriate design code being challenged, that makes it really hard to get information out there. Because for any piece of valid information that we can get out there,
Mm-hmm.
they can spread a good amount of misinformation and package it in, scientific studies if need be. So there's a great amount of those out there too, especially around education and ed tech. Most of the
Mm-hmm.
studies, we've interviewed some veteran teachers who um, Matt Miles and Joe Clement, who wrote Screen Schooled, and they researched this in depth and looked at the studies and looked at who wrote them and who co-authored them. And an insanely high amount of those studies turns out is funded by big tech. So it's not necessarily obvious too that information that you're seeing might not be good information. So I think
Right.
that's why we're seeing that. That's why it's so hard to get that info.
Yeah. And misinformation and disinformation is actually amplified and
Right.
pushed up the algorithm. I did an interview with Imran Ahmed of the Center for Countering Digital Hate recently, and he explains that really well. I think that one comes out on Monday, so it'll be out by the time this one comes out. But um, I I watched the trailer for the documentary again this morning, and it is really powerful. And I wonder if you can just give us an overview of what your goal is with this documentary.
Yeah. So my goal has always been to talk about solutions, and I think because it is a David and Goliath situation, right? It's very
Mm-hmm.
easy to feel hopeless, and the narrative has been this. This is a very uneven fight, and I think that's an important narrative to have. It's an important thing to recognize, because if we don't
Mm-hmm.
recognize how uneven the playing field is, we blame ourselves for the wrong things.
Mm-hmm.
It was easy to, look at your 13 years and be like, what the heck is wrong with my willpower? How am I spending so much time on this device? How am I wasting so much time of my life?
Mm-hmm.
What is wrong with me? Right. And that is a very unhelpful narrative.
Yeah.
I think it's important to remember that every time you open that device, you have a supercomputer pointing at your brain, as Tristan Harris says, and this is not an even fight. But
Mm-hmm.
then what do we do with that, right? Like, how do we move forward from that?
Yeah.
And I think we need to remember, like, the David and Goliath story is actually a great story, I think, because David did defeat Goliath,
Mm-hmm.
even though it was so incredibly unlikely. Goliath was a giant, and David was just a regular guy.
Mm-hmm.
And how did he defeat him? I actually looked this up because it's one of these
Mm.
stories you kind of know.
Yeah, I don't
How did
remember.
he actually defeat him? I don't remember. And turns out he defeated him by grabbing a stone, putting that in
Mm.
his sling, and shooting the stone right between Goliath's eyes, and it knocked him
Mm.
out.
Mm.
So a very targeted thing that didn't actually require much strength, but it did
Right.
require a plan, and it had to
Right.
be targeted. And I think that's actually a great analogy, because what I'm finding is, even though it seems like such an overwhelming thing to take on, if we're targeted in our response, and if we understand the nature of the uneven fight that's happening here, there's
Mm-hmm.
actually a lot of wiggle room, a lot of leeway to make good choices and start flipping the script on exploitative tech that we're seeing, and move towards a technology that enables us as human beings rather than degrades us, and I guess you could say enslaves us, to an extent.
Yeah.
So I was really interested in solutions, and partially that was based on my own experience of being very addicted to my phone for work and having to work to reverse that and
Yep.
step out of that. And so I knew I didn't want to put myself in a film. That's just not what I do. So I was looking for interesting stories of people
Yeah. Yep.
wrestling with this. And I got introduced to Kristen Bride at a time when I thought the film might actually look much more at the individual level of what are some choices that we can make as parents, as young people, as working professionals,
Yeah.
to not be so tethered and to have more command over where our attention goes.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was starting to dig into this, I quickly realized there's a whole political dimension when we talk
Oh,
about
yeah.
regulation, when we talk about what big tech can and cannot do, or should and
Mm-hmm.
should not do, that I need to look at as well, because we can't treat this as an individual's problem with an individual solution. And right around that time, I got introduced to Kristen, and I thought, okay, that is a story that absolutely needs to be known. Like, she needs to be a household name, you know.
I
A
know.
mom
Agree.
who experiences the most terrible thing that could ever
Yeah.
happen to any mother, any and
Yeah.
gets up and works hard every day to change this,
I know.
to protect other people's kids, and shines a light on just how little protection there is right now.
Mm-hmm.
So that started to be the first story we followed. Just, you know, by happenstance that I got to meet her, and she was open to doing filming, so she became our
Mm-hmm.
first participant in a film. And meanwhile, I was looking for other stories that are more on that individual level of what are some, you know, some choices you can make. And I eventually ended up finding two amazing young people, Jack and Jess. They're both creatives.
Mm-hmm.
You know, coincidentally, I wasn't necessarily looking for that, but
Mm-hmm.
I think it does come up in the creative space a lot, because you're being told you have to have an online presence, and you know,
Yeah.
this is how you get your art out and your work out. And
Mm.
when I met Jack, he had already done this 30-day declutter. I met him through Cal Newport,
Uh-huh.
and he was struggling with loneliness a lot, which I think is
Mm-hmm.
something interesting to hear from a young man, not necessarily something that's easy to talk about, right?
Oh, yeah.
And he challenged himself to get out there and just start talking to strangers, and meeting people, meeting strangers out in the real world. So he started
Right.
doing these little gatherings and get-togethers with
Mm-hmm.
strangers. He went around, knocked on doors in his dorm. He was a junior in college at the time, and
Mm-hmm.
got people together to do whatever, like play basketball, make some cookies, things like that. And it's funny because
Yeah.
when you tell the story to anyone who's a Gen Xer or you know, or boomer, they're like, "Oh yeah, that's just how it used to be at college." But these days,
Yeah.
that is a crazy thing to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can see, I followed him around doing some of this, and you can see how uncomfortable people are at first when he approaches them. Every now and again, you get an extrovert, and they're like, "Yeah, sure, down for whatever." But
Yeah.
usually, they're like, "What is happening? Is this a YouTube gimmick? Am I going to be made fun of?" Like, there's a lot of
Oh,
hesitation.
wow.
And then
Right.
as people realize, no, this is genuine, we just want to hang out and have a good time, you know, they warm up and they open up, and everyone in the end just thanks him and is so glad that
Mhm.
that happens. So
Oh my
he
gosh.
started building a bit of a following through doing that, and then became a content creator off the back of that. So now he's in this interesting space where he's trying to negotiate how to keep that human connection authentic
Right.
and alive, and also be a content creator without getting sucked into catering to the algorithm. So that's one story.
Yeah.
And
I
then,
love that.
Jess is a young artist. She lives up in Toronto,
Hmm.
and when I met her, she was very addicted to YouTube.
Mm.
And so we ended up doing the 30-day declutter, and I filmed her during that process. So
Oh, wow.
that is a story of very much like, okay, here's an example of what this looks like, right?
Yeah.
And how it goes. And yeah, when I met her, she wasn't doing any personal art. I just had no motivation, no time, no energy for it. And now she draws every day. So that
Wow.
was
I love that.
a huge success and really
Oh,
special process to be able to follow.
I can't wait to see that. And those those face-to-face connections, I think, is where it's at. Like prioritizing face-to-face connections, which can feel uncomfortable. But I mean, these kids in college, even their prefrontal cortex is not even fully developed, and so how you can develop, well, I've learned through neuroscientists and different doctors, really strongly develop that prefrontal cortex all the way through till your mid 20s is through face-to-face connections, and that's how you really strongly wire that part of your brain that is not developed until those mid 20s. So um, that's very interesting. I can't wait to watch. Do you have a estimated date when it'll be released?
We are pushing to have it done by the end of this year, so it can release early next year.
Okay. Okay. Do you feel like me that things are changing, that there's more people talking about this, that there's more research, there's more legislation and lawsuits, going into discovery, so we're actually finding out more about Meta and more about Snap and what's going on behind the scenes? Do you feel like there will be change for the better in the next couple of years?
Yes, absolutely. I am an optimist in that regard. There will be change. I think the piece that I'm really hoping for is that we don't just stop at the level of removing harmful content, but we really talk about what does spending most of our day on screens do to us.
Yeah.
As you just said, there's an example of, especially for younger people who still have developing minds, developing brains.
Yeah. Yep.
It has a huge impact. But we also know brain plasticity is a real thing, right? So even for adults,
Mm-hmm.
it has an impact. And I think that's what I experienced firsthand.
Yeah.
So I do hope that we have the courage as a society to dive into the more uncomfortable questions. And I say uncomfortable because right now, so much of our economic infrastructure is set up around working online.
Yeah.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
so it's not an easy shift to make, and it is, I think, often will look like something that's quite expensive to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe it'll force us to slow down, God forbid. So what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
And before you know it, you're back in a conversation about economics and about, how do we
Right.
set up our whole system? Like it is really intricately tied to that. But I am I am very hopeful because I think we're getting to a place where we start seeing the costs of how we have been going about things since
Mm-hmm.
modernity. We're really starting to see the costs on all fronts, whether it's climate change or exploitative technology. And I do think we're getting to a place where we have to say no more. This isn't working. We need to pivot. So
Yeah.
I'm also hopeful that the deeper shift will happen, but certainly hopeful when it comes to online harms that we'll see some meaningful action in the short term.
Yeah. And when it comes to solutions, so we need to attack this from all sides. So we have legislation. We're trying for legislation all over the world. We have people like you spreading the message through media. We have, and me, through a podcast. We have lots of research organizations or exposing the harms. We have parents speaking out. We even have children, teens, adolescents speaking out about their negative experiences. But so this podcast, though, is for parents, and a lot of parents are in the dark on the harms and also feeling very out of control. Like, what can I do in my home? And on a home level, they're just like, my kid, all of her friends have Snapchat, and all of her friends have a phone. So I feel bad, and I want to give it to her, and I don't. So do you have any tips on down at the family level, like what parents can do to take back some control within their family and for their own children?
Yeah, for sure. And I always like to say up front, I'm not a parent.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I am relaying things that I have
Yeah,
learned from other
of
parents.
course.
And we've interviewed quite a few recently. I just went to a Wait Until Eighth meeting, which was really
Mm-hmm.
interesting,
Mm-hmm.
over in Park City, and
Mm-hmm.
also talked to some kids. Maybe let me start there because I think
Okay.
that's actually an interesting thing to know
Mm-hmm.
that is not getting out there at all, which
Right.
is when we talk to primary school kids and even like some younger middle schoolers, kids who are not allowed to have phones yet, you
Mm-hmm.
get a pretty mixed picture. Some of them can't wait to get a phone,
Mm-hmm.
but quite a few of them will tell you they don't really like phones. And some of them will tell you, my parents never pay attention to me because they're on their phones. Some of them
Mm-hmm.
will say, since my best friend got a phone, she's not talking to me anymore. It's like I don't exist. Um, they're quite aware that there's harmful content on phones and that phones make people unhappy. And social media makes people unhappy. I
Mm-hmm.
think the most positive endorsement of social media I've heard from a middle schooler was, there's some good and some bad to it, and you need to use it the right way. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
thinking, wow, look at that.
I know. You got
kids,
it.
kids have it shockingly figured out.
Yeah.
So there's this perception out there that all that a kid ever wants is a phone and a social media and is unrestricted access to the internet. And in some sense, that's true, of course, because it's interesting, right? And it's like the forbidden fruit. So, of course,
Mm-hmm.
and it's somehow associated with growing up. So, of course, kids are going to ask for it.
Mm-hmm.
But there is also a bit of awareness that this is problematic. So, there is definitely an opening to have conversations with your kids about the very real dangers with technology. And the more that kids understand, that you do share these things openly with them, and they understand that you're being honest with them and that there is a risk,
Mm-hmm.
they will be much more open to coming up with rules together with you. So that seems to be a big piece of advice: is be firm in your rules, but
Mm-hmm.
involve the kids in a conversation. And the older they get, obviously, it all depends like what situation you're in, right? Like, they're still
Yeah,
young,
for sure.
you have a lot more leeway. Are they older
Yeah.
already and already addicted? Very different situation. So
Mm-hmm.
assuming here, younger kids, starting to talk to them about it early, and then making the rules together as they go and holding, so that they also hold themselves accountable. So it's not just something that's imposed from the top. I've seen cases where it was imposed from the top, and as soon as the kids go off to college, they dive right in and have
Yeah.
no experience in self-regulating, and then it's just a disaster. So
Yes,
that's
I've
a
heard that
very
too.
real danger there too. So I think really involving the kids early on and having those conversations is important.
Mm-hmm.
um, and wait as long as possible to introduce screens, really any screens, but certainly any interactive screens, into your kid's life. TV for so long was the thing we were really worried about.
Mm-hmm.
Turns out TV is actually not as overstimulating in many ways as interactive things are.
Sure.
So whether
Yep.
it's gaming, phone, tablet, uh, even though you might tell yourself, oh, my kid is, learning something on the tablet, all in all, that is still a much more addictive experience than just sitting down and watching,
Mm-hmm.
which is surprising. Like, that was a really surprising piece of information I came across.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't expect that.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be so tempting to give your kid a screen, especially if they ask for it. But even if they don't ask for it and you just need a moment of quiet and you want to relax because it's craziness at home,
Mm-hmm.
screen will do the job in most cases. So it is very tempting. But I think it's important to remember that the problems that you'll have once that screen is introduced and once it's part of your family life are by far going to outweigh your kids having a bad day and screaming about something. It will very quickly become the focal point of fights in a family. That just, from all the parents I've talked to, that is the thing I hear the most often. Like, wait as long as possible. And
Mm-hmm.
the thing that makes it so much easier to wait, and where I feel a huge amount of hope actually, is having at least a couple more parents who feel the same way you do and who have similar rules in place, because doing that alone is very hard. You don't want your kid to be ostracized. You don't want a kid to feel excluded and and
Mm-hmm.
lonely. But if you have a couple more parents, if you feel the same way, and your kid has people to hang out with,
Yeah.
who also don't like default to spending time on a screen, that is huge. So parents, find like-minded parents around you. I think that is the single most important thing.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. And then when it comes to a kid who's already addicted, that is more complicated. It's a bit more on a case by case basis.
Yep.
Oftentimes, kids will admit that they don't feel great. So I think it's a lot about taking the time to talk to your kids, see how they feel about it, come up with a solution together.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and sometimes it's baby steps, sometimes it's quite radical steps, but
Right.
um, it tends to not work very well to impose something from the top,
Right.
and can be actually quite dangerous. And if you talk to Laura, I'm sure you covered this, but
Mm-hmm.
taking a phone away can have tragic consequences too in some cases. So it definitely is about really giving your kid that space to tell you how they feel and what they're experiencing, and making
Mm-hmm.
sure they know they can trust you. Like, that trust and knowing that they can come to you when something terrible happens is more
Mm-hmm.
important than anything else. It's more
Yeah.
important than any monitoring software you could put in place. Like, they need to know that they can come to you for stuff. And I
Yeah.
know that's hard, especially at a certain age. That is hard.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah.
Sarah, you just hit on like every single thing I've heard in all of my interviews for tips from parents, like just the best summary.
Yeah,
um,
good. that means we're getting a body of knowledge, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're all talking to the
Which is
same
really
people.
good. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But one thing that came up for me is when I learned the other day, do you remember Baby Einstein videos? Did you not know?
No,
Okay.
I
Baby
grew
Einstein.
up chronically not online.
Yeah,
Also,
you're right.
in Europe, so I don't know when that was when that happened.
Okay. Yeah, probably, I guess it was before, maybe 10, 15 years ago. Baby Einstein, a mom started Baby Einstein, which just started out with little puppets and it was a
Mhm.
like a show, and then Disney bought it and everyone had it. Everyone was watching it. I guess you would buy the DVDs because it was
Mhm.
prior to streaming. And I mean, most households were putting their kids on Baby Einstein and thinking that, wow, my kid's learning so much, and they're babies and toddlers on there. And
Wow.
there was studies done after a few years of this showing that those children watching Baby Einstein a lot were actually less developed in their language skills and their just overall development than those who were not watching that specific show. And so it just people think that because their kids doing a educational seeming app or watching a show that seems educational, that their kids are Einsteins or geniuses. But another thing that Carl Marcy, the neuroscientist, told me about was that babies 2 and under can't take what they've learned from a tablet and like apply it to the three-dimensional world. So it's actually like there's no connection and no benefit to doing that screen rather than the face-to-face connection that is the priority.
And the physical world, right? Like
Yeah,
learning to manipulate the physical world there.
right.
And now I don't know who coined this, but there's more and more of an understanding out there now that probably the way that abstract thought developed in humans in the first place is
Mm-hmm.
by us manipulating the physical world. So,
Yeah.
we make a spear out of a stick, and then the abstract idea of what a spear is comes into being.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, like reliving that, seems to be absolutely crucial. And then part of the
Mm-hmm.
reason that schools like Waldorf School put so much emphasis on physical skills,
Yeah.
it's not that you know how to garden and you know how to do woodwork. I mean, that's great, could come in
Mm-hmm.
handy. Maybe it does,
Mm-hmm.
maybe it doesn't.
Yeah.
But it does something to the way that you process information.
Yeah.
Process, that's a very technical term, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
we're
Yeah.
infused by that tech lingo. I'm trying to move away from that. The way that we take in information
Yeah.
and digest information and make sense of the world around us. So
Yeah.
just being there in the physical world is hugely
Mm-hmm.
important for kids. And the younger the kids are, the more that is true.
Yeah. Um, I remember I read a physical book, I think on vacation recently, and I found a couple times I like tried to click on the book. Have you ever done that?
No, but I have tried to scroll up on the page before.
Yeah,
And
right.
yeah, not a good feeling.
No, you're like, oh crap, like
Yeah.
that. So I wonder, are you a fan of what people call the dumb phones or flip phones or the light phone, any of those stripped down phones targeted towards,
Yeah.
like they have children's companies like Pinwheel and Bark and those companies that are making ones for kids, I think more like teens, but yeah, are you a fan of those products?
Yeah, I would say definitely a better idea for starters than an iPhone.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of a great way to start learning to exist in that more digital virtual space and
Mm-hmm.
negotiate some of these things.
Yeah.
Uh, I might be biased because that was my own, I'm a millennial. That was my own
Yeah.
situation. First thing I
Right.
got was a flip phone, and you kind of text slowly and you don't text too much
A
because it's really
B.
annoying.
Yeah.
But you get into like the flow of what it means to text and some of the do's and don'ts and all the social
Yeah.
rules of texting. Like you start slowly getting into that, and I think that's nice, like having that gradual exposure to it
Mm-hmm.
without getting too sucked in. And I mean, the huge benefit is that you don't, depending what phone it is and what it can and cannot do, but I would
Yeah.
say just whatever you do, no unrestricted access to the internet. And on
Mm-hmm.
iPhones, the reality is just right now, it's still very hard to control that. And
Yep.
kids
Agree.
are amazing at hacking around controls,
Yeah.
and they will do it. Jack, who's one of our participants, like he told me stories of doing just that.
Mm-hmm.
During computer science class, and when he
Mm-hmm.
was 12 years old, he was like hacking into the school network. He's also in cybersecurity now, so he made that
He's inclined.
calling. But that is what's going to happen. And even if your kid doesn't exactly know how to do that, you bet someone of their friends does. So they will find ways around it. And the dumber the phone, the better, because you can sleep a little better at night knowing that, the opportunities they have to get into things are limited. So I think it's a great idea.
Yeah.
Am I a fan of adults going back to flip phones? I mean, if it helps you, sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
It might not be a bad idea, especially if you are a parent who struggles with being on their phones too much, and that is a big piece. I think looking at what are our own habits and what does that teach our kids non-verbally,
Yeah.
implicitly, is also a big piece. And with the current work culture we have, certainly not an easy one to figure
Right.
out. But it's definitely, I would say it is helpful, at least for a time, to try that out. Whether it is a digital declutter you're doing, or you just get a flip phone for a month and see how you go.
Yeah.
It does help just to hit the reset button a bit,
Yeah.
because you will get a much clearer perspective on what's actually valuable in your life and what you just assumed was valuable. And that I found extremely helpful. And I think as a parent, that is a very helpful thing to do as well.
Yeah. I did a no phone day where I did 20, from when I woke up to when I went to sleep, didn't touch my phone. And it was, I did a little episode about my takeaways, but it was eye-opening. I mean, my eyes were up. I was observing so much more, enjoying my day. I did things I hadn't done in a long time. I, wrote and read. And, but yeah, doing it for 30 days would be interesting, as far as not no phone, but having a more of a dumb phone and just doing work on your computer like we used to. And then leaving your desk and you're done for the day. Or maybe you need to go check a couple times, but you can leave the room and close the door, and that's what that's for. And then your time with your family is just separate, because the overlap is stressful.
Yeah, definitely. And having those pockets of time away from your phone has been huge.
Yeah.
For everyone I've spoken to, and then in my own experience as well, it really does over time. It might not seem like a big deal at first, but over time I found it has absolutely just calmed me down. My mood is better. It had all sorts of effects that I didn't expect, like a better mood. Like that was not something I thought I was going to get out of it. I thought I was going to be more productive, could maybe finally sleep properly, feel rested. Did not think that my mood was going to improve, like notably.
Well, you were letting your dopamine kind of settle back in. So you're giving yourself a lot of dopamine spikes. And then that's what doctors have recommended with children too, is give them good amounts of time without their screen so that they can replenish their dopamine and it kind of gets back to baseline. Because the constant spikes all day diminishes their receptors for dopamine and makes it harder and harder for them to actually feel excited about something. So
which is why so many people, and kids included, have the feeling that they're not motivated to do anything.
Exactly.
And that's the hump to get over, right? We don't feel very motivated to do something. We feel stressed out. We're exhausted. And the easiest way to get out of that is actually to go and do something. Do something that's maybe a little bit hard or a little bit scary, and then realize that you can do it. Have a success experience. And maybe that doesn't come right away. And that's okay. But I think attempting something slightly hard is the best solution, and something that's away from the screen.
Yeah, there's something that's uncomfortable. Like in that example of the face-to-face of going up to people in person and asking if they want to do something, that can be very uncomfortable for people. And you're also making the other person potentially uncomfortable. So it's like easy to avoid, but that's where the real stuff happens. That's where the real connection happens. I wanted to ask, I wonder if you have done any work or research into phone bans in schools or phone use in schools?
Yeah, we've interviewed quite a few principals.
Okay.
And Matt and Joe are big on that as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, me
Do you
too.
have a specific question around that? Or?
Yeah, maybe. So phone bans. So I have one video on Instagram that's going to get to 5 million views soon. And people have very strong opinions about, I'm just reporting on a school that implemented a phone ban and said that they had positive results with it, more engagement, excuse me, less bullying, things like that. And a lot of parents are upset at the idea because they, for safety reasons, they want to be able to get a hold of their children, especially in the US with school shootings in the news, and they want to be able to know their kid's okay. Or or just generally get a hold of their child at any time. And but then I've also talked to teachers who are like, it's actually very unsafe for children to have phones in their hands during an emergency like that, because the noises, and they're distracted and all of these things. But I read one article a couple of days ago, maybe in the Guardian, that a school in Massachusetts implemented a smartphone ban, but they actually gave each kid and each teacher and admin a light phone. And so they distributed light phones to everyone, and kids grumbled about it. But it's turned out really good. They gave feedback after a year of doing this. And I know this is an expensive thing, but I think that's an interesting, compromise for parents to still be able to get a hold of their children, but their children not have access to social media and the internet. So I guess my question is, do you agree that smartphones should be banned in school? And are you hearing any pushback like I am from parents or any parties?
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I'm actually more of a hardliner. I'd say ditch the light phone. I love the light phone, but I don't think the kids need a light phone. The parents might think the kid needs a light phone.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of layers here. One of them is that horrible scenario of what if a school shooting happens, and I think we have this feeling that if only we have a phone on us, right, we're safe. Like if only we have a phone on us, we can call help. And the reality, especially in a school shooting, is unfortunately that's in many ways not the case. Number one being kids are actually instructed to be quiet. So what are you going to do with your phone?
Right.
And if you end up using your phone to do something that might give away your location and make your situation worse. So now you have that situation where a kid, under extreme stress has to decide what the right course of action is. So there's that. Then there is the other level of if you have law enforcement entering the school and assessing what is going on, and they enter a dark room and all of a sudden they see a bunch of like lights pointed at them, because what kids will most likely do is try to film what's going on, right?
Yes.
That is very hard to get them to stop. So you have a police officer entering and a bunch of lights pointed at him, dark figures holding something pointed towards him. He or her has to make a split second decision, like what to do in that scenario. Wow. So again, not a good situation to happen. I think there's this kind of abstract sense, this vague sense that if my kid only has a phone, they can reach me and I can protect them. But the reality of a school shooting is the phones very likely create more of a problem than a solution. The more everyday challenges, I think that's where it can feel like a real inconvenience for parents to think, okay, my kid does not have a phone. Like if they get to school on their own, like, did they make it to school all right? Like that worry, right? Sitting with that isn't easy as a parent. Can totally understand that. And then, maybe you forgot to arrange something and you just want to tell them real quick, actually, I'll meet you then and there. Like the convenience of being able to reach your kid all the time, I would actually wager that's a much bigger reason for parents wanting their kids to have phones.
Yeah.
Because our life is chaotic and nothing is planned out properly anymore. There aren't processes. Like nobody sticks to schedules. So this is actually kind of challenging.
Right.
And I think it's important to acknowledge that, because people will say, oh yeah, back in the day, we did it without phones. It's easy. And it's like, yeah, but also people knew how to keep an appointment back in the day, because it wasn't just looking around 5,000 times during one workday. Now it is. So I think there is actually, this will get diminished a lot by people of like, oh, back in the day we did it, like call the school, it's fine. I understand that it's a bit more complex than that. And I think that's where some dumb phones might come in handy. But I would say, just in talking to teachers and some students, being interrupted during a class because your parent is texting you and you don't know if it's your parent texting you or your crush. So if you get a text, like you're looking at that text, you know what I mean? That is so disruptive. I hope we get to interview Gloria Mark, who wrote Attention Span. And she really dives into it. Every time we do so-called context switching, it takes up to 20 minutes to get our attention back to where it was. 20 minutes. So if you think, a class of like an hour and a half, one text can blow that apart. So I think there's really, really a strong argument to be made to not have phones during the school day. Maybe be
Mm-hmm.
able to access the phone during a break in the middle of the day to see if anything came in, or otherwise access the phone at the end of the day when you leave, and then you can arrange with your parent where to meet. But I think a little bit of planning your kids' day just a touch more so that you don't need to reach them during the day
Yeah.
is actually going to be huge for them and for
Yeah.
their ability to focus in class. So I do hope that we get to some kind of model like that where it's maybe
Mm-hmm.
you access your phone once in the middle of the day.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's an emergency in terms of I need to get in touch with my kid right now, in that case, calling the school office and having them be pulled
Mm-hmm.
out of class is actually a great thing, because if it really is an emergency, and this, I again talked to some teachers and they told me some harrowing stories of kids finding out in the middle of a class that a relative had died,
Oh.
and they're just sitting there and they have no one, no school counselor or anyone to talk to them and like guide them through it. They're just sitting in class trying to deal with that because they just got it over text.
Oh, yeah.
That's actually not an ideal situation.
No.
It's better in that case that the kid gets pulled out and there is a
Mm-hmm.
bit of, a structure around them, and they're not like surrounded by their classmates and having to deal with that. So
Mm-hmm.
I think there's actually an argument to be made. If there's that kind of emergency, the old route works really
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's definitely a complex picture,
Yeah.
and I don't want to diminish how complex it is, especially from the organizational front for parents.
Sure.
But I do think phones out of schools is a great idea,
Yeah.
especially the younger kids are.
I think I read about 80% of schools in the US are trying to implement phone bans or smartphone bans, but that actual implementation is difficult and that each teacher sort of has to figure it out on their own, and there's not a lot of support. Some teachers are reporting, excuse me, that they don't want to touch the kid's phone because then they're liable if something happens to that
Yeah,
phone.
and that puts them in a really, really difficult situation. Some teachers will do it, but it is
Mm-hmm.
their property, and a lot of teachers will tell you it feels like taking a body part away from the students. So
Yeah.
this is a really difficult thing to negotiate, and it really needs to come from the school,
Yeah.
or the school district. It needs to come from the principal, from the administration. And all the stories I've heard from schools who've done it was difficult in the beginning. The students would complain in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
The bigger backlash came from parents, almost always. Parents were
Mm-hmm.
more worried about it than students. Students would complain, but students complain anyway about the
Yeah.
wrong thing. So that's not such a big problem. But the
Mm-hmm.
parents, there was some serious backlash in some cases. And then
Mm-hmm.
as it settled in, it was without a fail a success story every single time. Like
Yeah.
learning outcomes improved. The atmosphere in school improved. There were fewer fights, fewer altercations,
Mm-hmm.
less drama of,
Mm-hmm.
he said, she said, the student filmed this fight. And now, like, there is so much fallout that needs to be managed by teachers and
Mm-hmm.
administrators every day, because everything now becomes the school's problem that happens on social media, and a lot of
Mm-hmm.
things happen on social media. So just creating an environment where learning can be prioritized again, as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
all of that other,
Yeah.
is incredibly helpful. And I think the thing that really, speaking of things that stuck with me in interviews,
Mm-hmm.
one of the ones that really stuck with me is when we interviewed Matt Miles and Joe Clement, and I asked them
Mm-hmm.
what was the moment when you started researching the impact of screens in schools. And
Mm-hmm.
they said, well, there's this free period where kids can just work on whatever they want to work on, and in the
Mm-hmm.
past it used to be impossible to keep them quiet. It was kind of a zoo,
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
period. And
Mm-hmm.
now it is silent. you know
Yeah.
you can hear a needle drop because everyone is on their phones. And they said, yeah, the most you might see is like a student showing another student something on their phone,
Gosh.
but everyone is sitting there by themselves. And I think that picture
Mm-hmm.
says 1,000 words, right?
Another one I heard yesterday is that kids will walk with their shoulder against the wall and walk along the wall so that they don't have to look up, so that they can keep their
Oh,
eyes down.
no. Okay, that is wild. That's next level.
Crazy stuff that you're hearing around this.
Yeah.
And I think here what stands out for me is like parents, we have power too. And if we decide that we're going to give the gift of a non-interrupted education for our kids and uninterrupted education for our kids, and the gift to our teachers of not having our children be distracted. Like we don't have to send smartphones to school with our children. We can make that decision. And I think like through this work, I'm just trying to find where parents can take some power back and take some control. And if as a society, parents stop giving their kids smartphones at 10 and stop letting their kids have access to social media at 13, that will make a difference if enough parents put their foot down and say, this is not safe. I'm not going to let you control when my kids have access to these things.
Yeah, 100%. And I think something that John Haidt, the psychologist, said um, is a really, really good call out, is that you always imagine everyone has to do it for it to work, right? It's like, well, if one kid has a phone, all of them want phones.
Mm-hmm.
But it's actually, the threshold is much lower. It's like if your kid doesn't have a phone and there are at least 3 other kids in class who don't have a phone, it's a lot easier than if your kid is just the only kid who doesn't have a phone. So you don't need to convince everybody, but
Yeah.
you do want to convince a few.
Yeah,
You
for
want to
sure.
convince a few so that your kid is not left, alone in this. And those few can be the change that then propel others forward.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think parents have a huge amount of power.
Yeah,
I
I
would
agree.
say that's one of the places where we'll see the most push for change coming from. Um, and I mean, historically, it has been too, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's parents care about their kids, and big tech does not care about the kids. And big tech is telling parents to get out of the way. Big tech is literally saying, you don't understand your child's world because you're not on these apps. So who are you to say what's happening to them? Just let them be. Uh, Out of the way is the last place you want to be as a parent. Like, this is your kid. Like, you can, there just this stuff like kids learn differently today, kids communicate differently today.
Mm-hmm.
Use my language, but that's a bunch of bullshit. We're all still human.
Yeah.
And that is a narrative that is very purposefully planted to get you as a parent to step aside and let big tech raise your kids. And that's the last thing you want.
Okay. Well, let's start wrapping it up. I loved that that whole line. Um, okay, so Sarah, you have been so wonderful today. It really relieves me that there are people like you doing this work and exposing the harms. We have to, like I said, attack this problem from all sides. And I'm a big fan of you and your work, and I can't wait to watch Your Attention Please later this year. Where can listeners connect with you if there's a place they can? We definitely want to send them to yourattentionplz.com, right?
Yes, yeah, that is the best place.
Okay.
And that's currently the only place where the film is at. We will
Okay.
probably, be doing a social media campaign, probably with the calculator closer to launch to get a bit more attention on it.
Okay.
But right now, yes, the website is a great place to go. We have a newsletter. We have a trailer out. It is password protected, but you can always give us a shout through our contact form and we can get you the password if you want to check it out. And can I do a little plug here?
Yes, of course. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. We've shot almost everything at this point, so that's really great. We're just jumping into the edit now. We are still looking for partners. We're looking for investors to come on board. And we also take tax deductible donations. Also interested in partners in general. If they're like-minded organizations who want to connect with us, or even individuals who are active in the space, always happy to connect and amplify each other's messages. So don't be a stranger. Reach out.
Perfect.
And we'd love to talk to you.
Yes. So yourattentionplz.com. And I would love to push out when you guys have this social media campaign. I have just a small-ish growing audience too. So I would love to help you push that out. Okay.
That'd be awesome.
Sarah,
And try to
thank you.
calculate.
Yes. Okay. So guys, get on yourattentionplz.com and do this calculator and share your results below. I'll do a little clip and prompt people to do that. I would love to compare notes and see where people
Awesome.
are at.
Yeah. You know what? The calculator, actually, the first time I did it, I had just seen a talk by Tristan Harris, fun fact. And I was alone at dinner in New York City, and the only company I had was my phone. And I thought it's very ironic if I go on my phone after I'd just seen this talk. So, well, let me put it to some good use and do something productive with it. And I was like, let me calculate how much time I'm actually going to spend on this if I keep going the way I'm going. And I got 9.5 years. Mind you, this was after I'd done the digital minimalism thing, and like my phone was black and white and notifications were off, and I'd done all these things already, right? So nine and a
Yeah.
half years was kind of still a kick in the gut. And I was convinced I had done the math wrong. I actually
Yeah.
went back and redid the math a couple of times different ways because I was like, there's no way this is right. There's no way this is right. But yeah, it is right. And it still hovers around that for me.
Mm-hmm. Are there younger people hitting like 20 years, or like what is the numbers looking like?
Jess, when she first did it, was somewhere at 30 years. And she's like, that's literally more time than I've spent on this earth.
Whoa.
I can't even conceptualize that. It's gone down to about 14, 15 years now since
Okay,
we've
good.
done the
Okay.
declutter. But yes, there are some very high numbers.
Oh my gosh, Sarah. Okay. All right. Encourage everyone to use the calculator. Let's share notes and work on this, because I think we should really think about that time and how we want to spend our time, right?
Yeah. Yeah, in
Okay.
the end, that's what it is, right? Like,
Yeah.
only
Sarah.
life is rather short, and what
Yeah.
do we want to do?
Yeah, exactly. Sarah, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate all your time.
Thank you, Nicki. This was great.